Hi, everyone. I am Rob Telfer with Friends of Illinois Nature Preserves, and we are very excited this evening to present to you the pressing concern of herbicide drift into Illinois natural areas. And we are joined by the Director of Ecological Health from the Prairie Rivers Network, Kim Erndt-Pitcher, and she is going to take it away. And then, yes, just a little housekeeping. Please keep your microphones muted. If you have questions, please put them in chat, and I will try to answer them. And if I can't answer them, then we will circle back at the end to your questions and answer them then. And so, yeah, welcome, Kim. Take it away.
Thanks, Rob. Can you see my screen okay?
Yes.
Okay. Welcome, everyone, and thank you for joining tonight's talk. For those of you that aren't familiar with Prairie Rivers Network, we are a statewide conservation organization. We have been working in Illinois for over 50 years, and we started out as a river conservation organization, and now we cover a wide range of program areas from clean energy to biodiversity to river health and water quality. And I'm excited today to talk to you a little bit about herbicide drift in Illinois and what we've been seeing over the past several years. So I'm going to turn off my video because I live in Southern Illinois, Jackson County, and sometimes our internet's a little iffy. And if I'm off video, then maybe this will go a little smoother. Rob is going to let me know if I start breaking up, and I can repeat anything that gets missed. So I'm going to start here by, there we go. Talking about a few main areas of this issue. I'm going to present to you the background and overview of herbicide drift. Then we're going to talk about PRN's monitoring and the ecological impacts of herbicide drift. And then we'll cover a little bit, just briefly, of the legislative framework that governs pesticides and what is being done right now across the state. So let's talk about the background and provide an overview of herbicide drift. As many of you probably know, in recent years, really the past 10 or so years, we've seen increased reports of off-target herbicide injury. Now, this has been to row crops, as you see here with these soybeans. These leaves are cupped and curled. They're not smooth soybean leaves that you see in a healthy plant. Injuries have also been reported to specialty crops. These are tomatoes, and they're curled and twisted. We've seen it in peaches and apples and grapes and backyard gardens, etc., as well as wild and cultivated plants. This is a sycamore leaf or a few sycamore leaves, and they are clearly cut. It was bowl-shaped, really. And this is a classic symptom of growth regulator herbicides. And I'm going to talk more of those in just a few minutes. But as a response to the numerous calls that PRN received on funny, their garden plants not growing properly or looking funny, and just concerns about the general health of the trees and plants they were seeing, and knowing that those injuries were symptomatic of herbicide exposure, we started the Tree and Plant Health Monitoring Program. And this would not be here today if it weren't for the dedication and the smarts of some really wonderful PRN volunteers. Lou Nelms, as well as Marty Kemper, both of them have been integral. There's a lot of people that around the state that have helped us make this program, but those two individuals have been really key. Marty particularly has done a lot of the data management and a lot of the monitoring, and we're just very grateful to him for his work and dedication on this issue. But, we use herbicides, and we use them a lot in the United States. We use them for chemical weed control practices in lawns. This is a big cause of drift, especially in many residential areas. Those herbicides, whether you apply them or chemical lawn care companies apply them, they can drift. They can hurt your own trees. They can hurt your neighbor's trees. We also use herbicides in management of right-of-ways and for invasive species control. But the large use of herbicides is really in Illinois' agricultural systems. But, you know, it's nice to step back and look at just our general use of pesticides in this country. We use approximately 1 billion pounds a year of conventional pesticides. And when I say pesticides, I mean insecticides, which target insects, herbicides, which target plants, fungicides, which go after fungi, and then rodenticides, which target rodents. That's a lot of pesticides every year. And by far, the leading cause of herbicide pollution in our state is agricultural use. And that's because over 75%, or approximately 27 million acres, of our land is in agricultural production. And the large majority of that land is planted with herbicide-tolerant soybeans and corn. And in these cropping systems, you know, they heavily rely on herbicides for weed control. And it's a different cropping system than we used to have. Historically, we would use herbicides early in the growing season, so spring before crops are planted in the ground to kill the weeds. Then there would be light tillage or cultivation that managed those weeds in those crops. Additionally, a lot of growers grew more than just corn or soybeans, so there was multiple rotations on that land. They might grow wheat, they might grow alfalfa, they might have animals. There was a lot of diversity to break up pest and weed cycles on the land. When we got herbicide resistant crops back in the 1990s, starting with glyphosate resistant crops, that started to change. We became more reliant on herbicides for growing crops. And, you know, nature did what nature does. It caught on, it evolved, and our weeds started to evolve and be resistant to those herbicides because we were using them early in the spring, but also throughout the growing season, because these resistant crops, these traits allowed us to spray the herbicide over the top of these growing crops. It would kill the weeds, but the crop plant would still survive. So we were using more herbicides throughout the growing season and less or fewer other techniques to manage weeds. So as a result of these herbicide-resistant crops, we've started to have to create more tools or use old tools in the toolbox to manage these resistant weeds. And that's been new traits that are resistant. So now we might have a crop plant that is resistant to glyphosate and dicamba and 2,4-D and glufosinate. And some of these crop traits, these seed technologies, can be resistant to 3, 4, or 5 different types of herbicide. So as you can see, there'd be a cocktail or the potential for a cocktail of herbicides to be applied throughout the growing season. And that has real consequences for our environment. And this is some data from the Geological Survey. And this is trends in agricultural use. This isn't for lawn care or anything like that. I would like to have that data in here, but this is just for agricultural use of 5 popular herbicides that we use widely in the Midwest. Dicamba and 2,4-D at the top are both regulator herbicides. That's a thing that these herbicides target the growing cells in the plant, and they change the way that plant grows. And the intention is to kill that plant or to kill the weed in the crop. Also, atrazine down here on the bottom, widely used, has been widely used for many years. We have glyphosate and glufosinate. But what I want you to look at is the dicamba graph for a second. Right around 2016, you'll notice a sharp increase in the use of dicamba. That's when those dicamba-tolerant soybeans and cotton came out on the market, and the use of that herbicide skyrocketed. We also started to see a tremendous increase in injuries across the landscape. 2,4-D, which is another growth regulator, it's also pretty volatile, meaning that it can move off site and cause injury away from its intended target. It's also been being used more widely in recent years. These graphs, you should note that they stop at 2019. We're hoping that the USGS releases the new data all the way up to 2023 in this spring. Glyphosate, you can note down here in the bottom center, use continues to increase and then it kind of levels off. It looks like it's declining just a little bit. That's indicative of we're using more to try to beat these weeds, but it's not really working. At the same time, glufosinate is starting to really take off because it sort of is in the same group as glyphosate in terms of action in the weeds that it can kill. So these are two short videos to kind of help us understand when I say herbicide drift, what that means. And this first one here, if I can get it to work, is for particle drift. And particle drift happens, oops, sorry, this is vapor drift. Vapor drift happens days after application. So the herbicide volatilizes into the atmosphere, moves long distances, and then lands on non-target plants. It also lands on water bodies, on homes, and on playgrounds. It lands anywhere it wants to, but it causes damage to the plants that it comes in contact with. And dicamba and 2,4-D and atrazine are some of the volatile herbicides we use. They're known to move off-site even several days, up to a week even after application, and cause harm. I'm going to see if I can go back here and we'll talk about particle drift. So particle drift occurs when droplets of the herbicides blow away from the intended site and hit non-target plants. And this happens at the time of application. So particle drift can be a result of misuse. Perhaps the applicator is applying when it's too windy, or they're not using, the right nozzle size, or they're driving too fast according to the label on the package. So that label on that herbicide is the law. And so particle drift can often happen when there is a case of misuse. They're breaking the law by not applying according to the label. Vapor drift more typically happens, it can even happen, I should say, when the applicator applies it 100% according to label. They did nothing wrong. It's simply the volatility of that herbicide and its tendency to move off-site. Okay. So now let's just do a little bit of a dive into the monitoring and our ecological impacts of herbicide drift. Before we do that, I think it's important to look at these symptoms and think about the differences that we see. For those of us that know what this looks like, sometimes it can be hard to visualize a healthy leaf. And when you see a healthy leaf, you're like, oh my gosh, that's a healthy leaf. That's wonderful. And red buds are one of those trees that is just exquisitely sensitive, particularly to growth regulator herbicides. On the left, we have a healthy red bud leaf. On the right, we have an inbred leaf, and you'll see the cupping, the curling. There's some scalloping in those edges, or they're wavy. And there's also a little bit of chlorosis or yellowing occurring in these leaves. Down below, the same, injured and healthy leaves, and sugar maple. And so on the left, we see these smooth, flat, beautiful sugar maple leaves. On the right, they're cupped, they're curled, they're clearly deformed. Other common leaves that we might see injury on and that are prevalent around is wild grape. Cultivated grape looks very similar. It's pretty sensitive to growth regulator herbicides in particular. You can see these irregular margins, the scalloping. These leaves are reduced in size, they're stunted. And then down here on the bottom, post oak. These injured leaves on the right, they're almost like a cobra head, is what I've heard one of the researchers in Missouri say. And they're just severely cupped. Their surface area is reduced, and they're also twisting and turning, and we call that epinasty. But these injuries can have real implications for ecosystem health and individual plant health. Now, we want to talk a little bit about what influences the severity of these symptoms, particularly with growth regulator herbicides. What we see is, we think, just kind of the tip of the iceberg. Some plants are more sensitive than others, but certainly the rate of exposure influences the severity of symptoms. The herbicide in question, the species, some species like redbuds and oaks tend to show symptoms more severely than other species. Individual plant health. You and I might be exposed to the same virus, and I might be down for 2 weeks with a really bad cough and fever. You might just have a little sniffle and feel fine. So plants are no different. Some are in better shape health-wise than others, and that can also influence how severely they show these symptoms. And the growth stage. We know, particularly for those growth regulators, flowering, bud swell, leaf emergence are all really sensitive times to be exposed to growth regulator herbicides. And of course, there are others that I didn't mention. So here's some of the summary. It's just a really brief summary of some of the data that we've gathered over the past 6 years. We just finished our 6th year of monitoring for herbicide injury across the state. And in those 6 years, we have documented injuries in 99 species of trees, 48 species of shrubs and vines, and 115 species of herbaceous plants. And when we go to a site, we're not just documenting symptoms in one tree or one species of tree. We're looking to see if there are symptoms across multiple plant families, across multiple species, and multiple layers in that environment. So we're looking at the ground layer, we're looking at the understory, and we're looking at the canopy. And that helps us realize, hey, this isn't disease. This isn't, some kind of pest. This is hitting multiple species, multiple plant types at different levels of this ecosystem, and it's indicative of herbicide exposure. On the right here, we have a picture of rosin weed. This I took on an organic farm, and they had a prairie on their farm, and all of the rosin weeds were twisted like this, sort of just like a spiral seashell. All in all, we have, in 6 years, performed 737 monitoring visits to sites. Many of these sites we have visited year after year. Some of these sites, as you'll see in a little while, we visited multiple times a growing season to get what's happening at that location. So herbicide injuries are occurring to these ecosystems and environments that are already stressed. And it's really important to understand that. They're experiencing climate change, floods, droughts, fire. They are being stressed by invasive species, whether it's the encroachment of other plant species or invasive insects. They're also encountering diseases and fire suppression. Some of these habitats haven't seen fire in a very long time, and that's stressful for them. Additionally, as I alluded to, herbicide exposures are often occurring multiple times a year and for multiple years in a row at some of these locations. And these chronic and repeated exposures really stress these trees and plants, and we're seeing that it's diminishing their health. So the literature tells us that exposure, particularly to growth regulators like 2,4-D and dicamba, in plants can reduce the number of flowers that they produce. It also decreases the visitation of pollinators to those flowers, and it can reduce the nutritional content in some of those plants, which can have larger ecosystem, implications if the nutritional content of, say, caterpillars and what they're eating or insects and what they're eating is not what it should be. Additionally, in the monitoring in many states around the country that are facing this very same thing that we are, we're seeing reduced leaf size, deformed leaf shape, decreases in fruit and nut production, whether it's an orchard or an oak tree, and reductions in the quality and quantity of those fruits and nuts. And like I said, many states are seeing declines in this. We work closely with Iowa, Missouri, Nebraska, the Dakotas, Indiana, Arkansas. We are not alone in this issue in Illinois. These next slides are just pictures of some of the nature preserves monitored. Many of these photos were taken by Marty Kemper. And Marty has just done a really great job of visiting a lot of these preserves and documenting the injuries. You're going to see a lot of oaks. That is not because we're only looking at oaks, but because they are keystone species. We are seeing decline in oaks, and they are a species of concern when it comes to herbicide drift. This is a white oak, and its leaves are clearly, even from a distance, curled and cupped. You all know this is one of the main ways this plant makes its food. Its surface area of these leaves is reduced. Many of the leaves are not facing the way that they should to gather sunlight. The same with this post oak at Beetle Barrens Nature Preserve on the other side of the state. These leaves are cupped, they're curled, they're deformed. Many of them are stunted. This nature preserve had evidence of multiple exposures of herbicide injury. And the reason I'm saying that is because when we visited, we saw leaves on trees that were severely stunted and curled. And then we saw a second push of leaves from this tree, but they also were curled and cupped. So it had made a second attempt to grow leaves, and yet they still got hit by herbicide. Here's another post oak. And again, you can see that the canopy is not what it should be. These leaves are curled and cupped. In all of these sites, multiple species were observed and documented with symptoms of herbicide injury. Looking for symptoms and identifying injury in multiple species is incredibly important and helpful, but we also take samples of leaves and have them analyzed at a lab in South Dakota. And we do this because it helps us understand what herbicides are causing these injuries. There's some downsides to it. Analysis is incredibly expensive. When we look at growth regulators, pre-emergence like atrazine and glufosinate and glyphosate, there's 3 different classes of herbicides. You're talking about $850 to $900 a sample, and that's 1 bag of leaves. So we would like to look at more herbicides, but those are the 3 main groups that we've tried to focus on as much as we can. Every sample that we've sent out, we've had analyzed for the growth regulators, which include that dicamba and 2,4-D. In the majority of the cases that we've sampled, we do not know when drift occurs. The exception would be if we get a call from a landowner saying, my wife and I were out working in our yard, we got exposed to herbicides 2 weeks ago, now my trees are looking bad. Then we have a window of when we think that exposure occurred, but that is definitely not the norm. So we're taking these samples based on their symptoms. There's numerous things that influence the persistence or presence of these herbicides in tissues. That's the type of plant, the rate of exposure, the degradation rate of that herbicide, and that can vary by the chemical and by the plant, as well as the weather is a really big factor. Was it rainy? Was it hot? Was it dry? Was it humid? Etc. I'm going to give you the next minutes of just 2 case studies. This is the state champion post oak. It's in Washington County, Illinois. We've been looking at this tree for many years. And this is one of the trees that we have done not only long-term monitoring and sampling on, but also serial sampling, meaning we've taken multiple samples throughout a growing season. And those samples are typically 2 to 4 weeks apart. This is a busy slide, but I have a lot to present, so I put all these photos on one slide. From 2017 to 2023, you can see every year this tree has curled cup leaves, they're twisted, they're stunted. They are not able to function the way that this tree needs them to. There's evidence here that it's tried to push out other leaves in some of these years where it's tried to make new leaves because of a severe injury early on. We've had 15 tissue samples analyzed from this tree. 14 of them had residues from 2,4-D, 6 of dicamba, 2 of atrazine, and 3 of metolachlor. Now, this is me standing under this tree this summer, and this canopy is thinning. This tree is stressed. Many of the trees that are also in this 40-acre pasture have been taken down because they have died, and they've also had symptoms of herbicide injury. This tree is magnificent, and there is not much that we can do to protect it at this point from this drift. We also did a study this summer in Champaign-Urbana, and we did this because we've been looking at this on farms, nature preserves, public lands, and private property for 6 years. And we're seeing that there are changes occurring that can impact ecosystems. And we're especially seeing that decline in oaks. And we're seeing increased tree death and real changes in tree canopies. This is a really busy map. I wanted to give you an idea of the land use. This is Champaign-Urbana. As you can see, there is agricultural use all around this community. And there's also really nice urban concentration. So you have potential inputs from agriculture as well as residential use, use in parks or playgrounds and private homeowners of herbicides. So we took 13 samples and had them analyzed, and the red squares are the red outlines represent samples that were taken on or near school properties, elementary, middle school, high school properties. We intentionally sampled sort of on the periphery of town as well as closer into town, chose areas near schools, and we also were very careful not to sample from properties where there was evidence of lawn treatment. On that property, that we saw broadleaf plants in the lawn or in the grass nearby. And if we did a public space, we did it where there was no evidence of treatment, and we even verified it with the public landowner that they did not use any weed killers or broadleaf weed killers in that area. Every sample that we took in Champaign-Urbana showed visible symptoms of injury. Those leaves were cupped, curled, twisted, deformed, and every sample had the presence of herbicides. So, you know, we're seeing decline in these trees in this community, and we're finding detectable levels of herbicides in every sample. Some of those samples had 3 or more herbicides in them. This is just one of the photos from the sites that we collected samples in Champaign-Urbana. This is Barnhart Prairie. It's also the site where Blue Stem Preschool is located. So Barnhart Prairie is a really beautiful prairie, and Blue Stem Preschool is on the grounds. And sort of more or less bisecting this prairie is a hedgerow that goes, you know, part of the way through it. And the children, there's a path mode. The children from the preschool go under that hedgerow. They play, they sit there, listen to the insects, they look at the flowers in the prairie, and they explore. And this is part of the culture of the school, is they spend their time outside. Well, we got one of our coworkers, his daughters go to this school, and he told me that he's getting messages that the children had to be taken in because they were smelling, feeling herbicide drift or pesticide drift. And So we went and we spoke to the director and we took samples of this and we spoke to, they also own the preserves. We spoke to them and said, can we take some samples and monitor? And we monitored, symptoms were prevalent throughout the school grounds as well as the nature preserve. And this Osage orange that we're looking at on the left is in that hedgerow. And it had multiple herbicides in the lab results. So multiple herbicides were detected in that lab result, in those lab results. And the penstemon had, significantly high levels. I shouldn't say significantly, it had high levels of glufosinate in it. This is where these children are playing. So this kind of brings us to that nexus of human health and environmental health. And we're seeing it, right here in these school grounds and a nature preserve. So what do we know about the human health impacts? I'm just going to touch really briefly on this. There's a lot of literature on this, but I also think that we're learning that we need to know a lot more than we do. Dicamba, again, widely used. Exposure can cause irritation of the eye, skin, and respiratory tract, as well as cause headaches, dizziness, and nausea. The EPA states that dicamba is not likely to be carcinogenic. However, some studies have found an increased risk of cancer for users of dicamba. And there's been some links associated with dicamba exposure and increased rates of hypothyroidism. 2,4-D, very similar health impacts, eye irritation, skin, respiratory tract irritation. Studies of farmers or professional applicators of herbicides containing 2,4-D reported an increased risk of lymphatic cancers, especially non-Hodgkin's lymphoma. And the other one I just wanted to mention was atrazine, really widely used. It can affect pregnant women and babies by slowing fetal growth, birth defects, as well as liver, kidney, and heart damage has been seen in animals that have been exposed to high levels of atrazine. And atrazine is widely detected in our environment. So this last segment, I know this is a lot of information, so thank you for hanging in there. I just wanted to touch on this legislative framework and what we're doing about this issue. So there are several bills or several pieces of legislation that kind of regulate pesticide use, manufacturing, registration, etc. The main one is the Federal Insecticide, Fungicide, and Rodenticide Act, or FIFRA, and it gives US EPA the authority to regulate these pesticides. We also have the Illinois Pesticide Act, which is administered by the Department of Ag, and it's our principal statute that regulates the labeling, distribution, use, and application and disposal of pesticides in the state of Illinois. Inside the Illinois Pesticide Act, there a statute requiring for there to be an interagency committee on pesticides. And this has to have certain members in it and representatives from IDOA, the Department of Natural Resources, Environmental Protection Agency, the Department of Transportation, the Department of Health, the Natural History Survey, and the University College of Ag. And it's interesting because this committee has a lot of responsibilities, including to consider the problems arising from pesticide use, with a particular emphasis on the possible adverse effects of human health, livestock, crops, fish, wildlife, etc. So we have the framework in our state, and we also have the Natural Areas Preservation Act, which is established the INPC, and it charges DNR and INPC with the responsibility of protecting our nature preserves. Now, I can't move on really without addressing the complaint process in the Illinois Pesticide Act. And this is an incredibly complex topic. It could be its own talk. It's also a really frustrating topic for a lot of people. And you know what I'm referring to if you filed complaints. This graph here shows the number of formal complaints filed to the Department of Agriculture for suspected pesticide misuse. And so, as you can see here, starting at around 2017, things start to get really, these numbers start to get really high, and they peak in 2019. And that's when those dicamba tolerant soybeans came out, and in cotton. And in Illinois, we had a lot of soybean acreages that were getting injured. We also started to see a lot of tree crops and wild and cultivated plant injuries, not just, agricultural commodities. And you'll notice that these things started to decline. Now, the key thing to take away from this graph is that this is our main tool in Illinois for reporting herbicide injury or suspected herbicide injury. But it is geared towards addressing and identifying cases of misuse, where an applicator does not follow the label. And if you were to file a complaint because you notice herbicide injury on your trees, you would file a complaint with the Department of Ag. They would come out, they would do an investigation, they would walk through your property. They would investigate the surrounding neighbors, the applicators, to see if anyone had applied according or off label and essentially broken the label law. And that's the intention of this. If they are found at fault, then there would be a fine or a warning letter, depending on how egregious the violation was. Now, in cases of volatility, when we don't know where these herbicides are coming from, so they could be coming from miles away, they cannot find anyone at fault. And these herbicides you can apply according to label law, and you're not violating, but you could still injure your neighbor. And there would be no compensation. There would be no fine. There would be basically no letter or warning or anything to help you get some closure on this issue. But you may have to pay for the damages, taking down your trees, losing a crop, what have you. So it doesn't address vapor drift. The other big problem with this issue is that there's a lot of fatigue out there. People feel intimidated to complain about their neighbors, so they might not complain at all. They also have complained for years and aren't getting any closure, aren't getting any resolution of their complaints, and so they stop complaining. Another reason potentially for this decline in formal complaints being received is that it's, in 2017, 18, and 19, a lot of this was row crop agriculture injury, soybeans that got injured from dicamba. And a lot of growers either stopped using dicamba or they started planting resistant soybeans as an insurance so that they wouldn't get injured. They might not use dicamba, but if they get drifted on, they'll still get a crop. And so there's other reasons, but even the United States or the US EPA acknowledges that approximately 1 in 25 cases of herbicide injury are actually reported, or just 1 in 25. So there's this whole, just large area, numerous areas that aren't actually being identified and reported. And that's with the people that know what these injuries look like. If you don't know what you're seeing, you don't know you have herbicide injury. Okay, enough on that. The final thing that I wanted to mention here is our Constitution. Our Constitution says, and I'm going to read this, the public policy of the state and the duty of each person is to provide and maintain a healthful environment for the benefit of this and future generations. And then it also states that each person has the right to a healthful environment. So this is in our Constitution. We're one of the few states in the nation that actually has phrases like this in our Constitution. And that can be to our benefit on many fronts, not just herbicide drift. So finally here, what are we doing about this issue? And by we, I mean PRN and our partners. We are in regular meetings with USCPA. They know our faces, they know our reports, they know our data. We are commenting on registrations and reviewing labels. We're doing it collectively and kind of sharing the burden and signing on. We're doing this with Xerces Society for Invertebrate Conservation, Audubon, Pesticide Action Network, Environmental Working Group, and the Center for Biological Diversity. We're also working and meeting with, people like me and land managers and state employees in multiple states that are dealing with herbicide drift and are concerned about the resources and the lands that they manage. On a state and local level, we are drafting legislation every year. It gets crushed, but we're not going to stop. We are working on it, trying to get it strong and trying to get something out there that actually makes a difference. We are working closely with our partners. We're writing reports like this one here. We were contracted to write for the Nature Preserves Commission on herbicide drift. We also have several other reports that we've written, and we're working on one right now. Marty and I are working on our summary of 6 years of monitoring. We also have a coalition called Save Our Trees. And this is a coalition of people that have been facing this issue for multiple years, and they see it everywhere they go. And they care deeply about the future of our environment and our trees and our ecosystems. And in coming years, we're going to continue our monitoring, but we're also going to look at water quality. We know that many of these herbicides and pesticides are water soluble, and we want to know, where they are in our surface waters, where if they're in well water, groundwater, and even in treated drinking water. So we'll be expanding into that this summer as well. And with that, I will leave you with take any questions that you might have.
Thank you so much, Kim. There are a lot of questions that we'll get to.
I'll do my best.
You did great. That was really helpful. I really appreciate your even tone and your judicious look at something that's very upsetting for a lot of people who care about nature and people. And so, I feel very, like Cynthia said, we are lucky to have you working on this. So I will say that I shared in the chat, I'll share it again. We are setting up an email list for updates on this issue specifically. Not only to keep people informed about the things that Kim shared at the end there about things that PRN is working on, but hopefully other new solutions that are starting to come out as more and more people become aware of this issue. We will also share out, if you want, you can join the Save Our Trees Coalition, and they meet weekly to discuss this issue and come up with solutions. And it's a coalition of folks from all over the state who are just trying to figure out how we can, save our trees and save everyone. But also, we know that it's a touchy subject. So please, if you want to stay informed, click on that link, add your email to it. And now I will turn the recording off and stuff can get real.